of what you're doing. It may be the entity that ultimately holds your assets or that you expect to hold your assets. These trusts can be revocable or irrevocable. It's kind of what those names imply. If you create an irrevocable trust and you transfer assets to it, that's a permanent transfer. Now let me hurry to add, though, while that does mean that you can't modify it, if it's a bona fide irrevocable trust, then you don't have the power to modify it or revoke it. Still, you can empower a trustee to modify it, and you select who your trustee will be, the person that runs the trust, and you have the ability to select someone in whom you have presumably a high level of confidence. We'll talk a lot more about trust as we go along. Insurance may not seem highly imaginative, but it's a critical element if you're talking asset protection. For asset protection purposes, insurance is critical. It anticipates liability, it anticipates death, which we know is inevitable. It anticipates a lot of problems that you can deal with someone else's money by simply paying premiums. So what you're doing is you're transferring risk whenever you use insurance. Another factor related to that is, I call it risk factor control, but it simply means that you decide that you're going to take steps yourself to minimize the degree of risk that exists in your environment. It can be anything from taking precautionary measures in the workplace. It may mean that you discontinue engaging in certain activities in the workplace, certain business services or products that you know are high risk, and you eliminate it. So you sort of preempt the need for insurance. An example may be that you're in a service enterprise. There are certain services you provide that you know are incredibly risky to you, either with respect to employment lawsuits or employment injury, or with respect to customers. And you decide that yeah, I'm making money from this, but I'm not making so much money that I want to live with this huge risk that really jeopardizes everything else I own. So it's not unusual for business people to make those decisions all the time. It may mean that you invest in your workplace or invest in your product or your services to minimize that risk. Maybe there are things, features you can add that minimize the probability of these things occurring. You know, as mundane as this discussion is, it's hugely important. You have the ability, and to some extent, in the activities that you engage in your daily life, to make decisions that will preempt the need for insurance and preempt the risk, or at least to a substantial extent, of litigation and other creditor actions. Exemption planning. Exemption planning is something that many people don't readily think of when they think of asset protection, but depending on the state that you live in or the state you're willing to move to, it can be very important. When you think about exemption planning, what you're really saying is, you know, what are my state's, or what are a particular state's laws regarding certain assets and how they're protected from creditors. We've decided as a nation in our bankruptcy laws and in our respective states' laws that some things should be protected from creditors. Now, for example, homes. Virtually all states have some version of a Homestead Protection Act. Now, it may be relatively low protection in some states. In some states, for example, it may assure that $8,000 of equity in someone's home is assured them in the event of bankruptcy or in the event of any creditor action, that whatever happens, they get that $8,000 out of their house. Some states go much further. Florida, for example, will protect up to a much higher number. At one time, it was an unlimited amount as long as it's a place that you lived, and they defined it not in terms of dollars, but they defined it in terms of the size of the tract of land. Now, there are some restrictions on that now, but still, Florida is hugely protective. I mean, the idea that you can go there and have $300,000 or more in a house and know that if a creditor sues you, that's protected. So homestead exemptions should be considered when you're talking about asset protection planning. Now, there are a number of rules, incidentally. It's not simply that you go to one of these states and you immediately buy a house and your coverage is complete at that moment. That's not the way it works. There are limitations and restrictions, and I want to emphasize when I talk about asset protection, it's asset protection planning. And the planning component means that you have to do things in advance. And I'm assuming that the people I'm talking to here are people who don't presently have creditors barking at their door. I mean, if the creditors are already knocking at the door, then that limits to a great extent the solutions that we're talking about here, because it raises issues of fraudulent transfers. We talked about that some last week, and we'll talk about it in great detail going forward, because it is maybe the primary hindrance when it comes to asset protection planning. If you were to sum it up in one single concept or one single problem, it would be the laws relating to fraudulent conveyances, fraudulent transfers. Those statutes exist everywhere, and they're a minefield, and you have to be very careful when you're doing asset protection planning that you don't misstep. So I'm assuming the people we're talking to here are people who are engaged in activities where they think there's risk, they have some wealth, and they want to protect it. And for those people, homestead planning and other exemption planning is very realistic, because you do it in advance. And you think down the road. You don't do it when you're already in a problem. So I mentioned homestead. Life insurance is protected in many states, so you can have a great deal of value in permanent life insurance. Retirement plans are protected federally and by state statutes. So many people have a lot of wealth placed in their retirement plans. Certain types of annuities are often protected. There's also some provisions in most states as to a given dollar amount of personal goods, or the personal goods may be described. But there's a short list of things that are involved in exemption planning, and so we won't spend an undue amount of time on that, but we will talk about it as it pertains to life insurance, the IRAs, and other retirement vehicles in your home. So that's a quick overview of what the asset protection toolbox is. I think what I want to do next week is to talk more about trusts, and I'll make a note to spend time establishing that foundation before we go further. And while it's important to know about each of these items we talked about, it's very important to start off with understanding trust. I don't see many estate or asset protection plans that are very good that have failed to utilize trust. I mean, they're just a key component. So as we go forward, I'm going to walk you through these topics, and you'll learn a lot about this. You'll learn far more than most people will ever know, unless they're lawyers, about asset protection. And many lawyers don't know about asset protection. As we probably mentioned before, it's an esoteric field, and many lawyers do not want to deal with it because it's so fraught with risk from the lawyer's standpoint. I mean, these tactics have to be done properly. They have to be done legally. You have to be very mindful of avoiding missteps with the IRS if your planning is going to be well done. So many lawyers just don't want to deal with asset protection. And those of us who do deal with it, we're very conscious of doing it correctly. And it means that you follow the rules. You don't try to outsmart the IRS.